Okay. All right, welcome to Payson City Planning Commission. Tonight we have 4 commissioners present, 1 online. Tyler, I don't know if you saw my email, but would you please give us an invocation?
Our dear Father in heaven, we are so grateful to come here this evening to discuss as a planning commission the city of Payson and the ways that it can grow and help us as we do so to remember the aim to find ways to serve those around us and to be more like them. We're so grateful for this country and for the way that we have to govern it, and pray that we can remember thee in all that we do, and we say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, has everyone been able to read the minutes from the meeting on August 24th? Any comments?
I'd make a motion to approve.
Second.
Okay, motion by Commissioner Morgan, second by Commissioner Moore. All in favor?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Public forum, but do we have any public online? Nope. All right. And we're on to land use training.
Make this somewhat informal, so Jill and I are going to bring it up there. Will everyone see that screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, so wow, that is really loud. All right, can everybody hear me fine? So to start our training off with, I'm assuming some of you may or may not have seen this presentation before, so it may be a review for you, but we did add a few things in here that are the specific duties that the Payson City Planning Commission is responsible for. And I think there's 1 or 2 things that have been added in here from recent state code amendments. So we'll just go through those, and feel free to interrupt me if you have questions, or you can save your questions to the end, whatever you want to do. Okay. So legal justification for planning in Utah comes through the state of Utah, which is derived from the federal government. I don't know if you've ever heard of the term policing power, but that's where the federal government dictates that policing power to the state of Utah, and that policing power is how zoning is incorporated in the state. And the state doesn't do much of that; they give that to the counties and cities, and so that's how we have our zoning. Anyone have any questions on this first slide, or should I continue on? Okay. I mentioned briefly about the state code. It's referred to as LUDMA, which stands for the Land Use Development and Management Act. Before this LUDMA was created, I want to say early 2003, 4, something like that, all of the state legislation for land use regulation was all over the place. And so they consolidated it into one place, and they adopted various codes and ordinances that they felt would be most advantageous for development in the state of Utah. Part of what's required in there is the mandate of a planning commission be created and land use authorities and appeal authorities be designated. So here on this slide talks about some of the basic themes from the Land Use Development Management Act, private property rights. Individuals are free to use private property as they wish unless valid written land use laws direct otherwise. Must clearly write it down, so the community has broad discretion to regulate private property. However, it must do so deliberately and openly. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the further slides. Must abide by the rules. So land use authority is bound by the terms and standards of applicable land use ordinances and shall comply with the provisions of adopted ordinances. Basically, what that's saying is the legislative body, or the city council in our case, has a wide array of what they can do in adopting ordinances and regulations, but they're very limited in what they can do once they're adopted because they have to follow what's written in their codes. And then the last thing on here, must act with reasonable diligence. Land use authority must process complete applications promptly. And that's just to do proper respect to applicants and to have due diligence, and so that things don't weigh down in the review processes and get killed, so to speak. We talked a little bit about the supremacy of laws and kind of where our authority comes to regulate land use. You can see from this slide being on top the federal constitution and then going downward what different authorities and rules and regulations apply. So everything above our local land use code supersedes it. Any questions on this section? Basically, we're at the bottom of the totem pole. That's right. But the little fish you notice is the happiest fish. So these are primarily state mandates. We have the general plan is a requirement by the state. And in there are 4 elements that are required to be in there. We have land use, transportation, affordable housing, and a water use and preservation element. That water use one is quite recently added. So those 4 elements need to be in the plan. Any other number of elements the city is welcome to incorporate into the plan. Jill, are there any other elements that are really kind of important to Payson City that we have in our plan now?
We have, I think we have an addition to.
I know that we have recreation sections.
Yeah,
and
so Parks and Recreation, I want to say that we have, I should know this.
nothing like putting her on the spot. But we can have any number of things. We can have economic development. We can have specific plans. We can have public facilities. Anything that the city designates is appropriate and necessary to adequately and reasonably control the development within the city. Land use ordinances, you can see there, we have the establishment of the Planning Commission and the authorities that they have related to land use ordinances. We have land use authorities and appeal authorities. What's the difference? Does anybody know? Do you want to speak up and say your mind about what any of those 3 are, or what the differences may be or similarities?
I know that at times we are the land use authority, but mostly it's the city council, so I don't know what the differences may be.
You said it perfectly right. So there's various land use authorities, and most communities have that. For example, staff are land use authorities when it's various administrative actions. Planning Commission, and we'll get to these, Planning Commission is a land use authority on a handful of things as well. And then, as you said, most are the land use authority is the city council. And we'll get to this a little bit later as well, but the appeal authority has to be a different individual or different entity than whoever made the initial land use decision. That way you're not prejudiced, so to speak.
For us, is that like the city attorneys or?
It depends on the use. It depends. We do have a board of adjustment, which last time they met was what, a couple of years ago. So the board of adjustment, I think, does several of the appeals and variances, I believe. But I know that city council is an appeal authority. And I want to say for at least one or two of the planning commission things.
And then just to go back, so I will tell you the chapters of our general plan. So first we've got the vision. We have land use, infrastructure, transportation, circulation, parks and recreation, economic development, housing, finance, and then our strategic plan. So as you mentioned, there's required ones, and then we have opted to go into further detail on some other items that are important to our community. So that's why ours is a little bit longer.
These other bullet points on this slide talk about various other things that can be regulated or must be regulated. For example, address residential facilities for elderly and persons with a disability. This used to be something where cities and towns could regulate this fairly strictly. Now it just falls under this Title 57, Chapter 21 of the Utah Fair Housing Act. And it basically means that they have to be allowed everywhere that a single family home is allowed. So there's very little control that can be done over these things now as before, which is an appropriate action because it is housing. The next one, allow manufactured homes which comply with zoning regulations. That has been an issue several years in the past. And so state code has made that requirement. Address cellular towers, non-conforming uses and non-complying structures. Anyone know what those are? Off the top of your head, an example?
Would we change our zone? Existing would be that doesn't require it.
That becomes a non-conforming building or use depending on what's going on the property, right? Allow educational facilities.
It's non-conforming, but it's legal.
Correct. Yeah, the correct term would be legal non-conforming. Yeah. I guess there's plenty of non-conforming that aren't legal as well. No, and that's never going to happen. Because half the time we may not even know they exist. Allow educational facilities, including charter schools, in all zones. Religious Land Use and Institutional Persons Act. Allow for uses protected by freedom of speech, such as adult-oriented businesses and sign content. What's an example of an adult-oriented business? Usually it's ones that sell adult content, sexually oriented businesses. A vape shop is actually going to be controlled similarly under what you can do with smoke shops and bars and things like that. So
again, those bars and smoke shops are not adult oriented, right?
it's not considered an adult-oriented business.
No, but there's additional state code requirements, sometimes with distance where they can be from a regulated space, you know, whether it's a library or
School or something like that. Yeah. So it's not considered an adult-oriented business as far as the state legislation goes. It's got its own legislation that potentially lets you limit those to some degree.
So we're in this in the right place, but it's like for non-adult oriented businesses, I don't know specifically what decides whether it's a freedom of speech sign versus like a business sign?
well, I think the easiest way to look at it is a city we can regulate time, place, and manner. So if somebody, you know, if we say it's a permanent sign or temporary sign, or, you know, how long you can have it, where it can be on your site, you know, because we want to make sure it's not in clear view, or, you know, we're going to determine, can it be a monument sign, can it be on the building, can it only be on the building? And then manner, just, is animated or, just. But then content, what you put in that sign area then becomes the freedom of speech issue. So that's why when we're looking at sign codes is once you allow time, place, and manner, once you identify that in your code and somebody puts a sign there, even they'll maybe have a sign that says, welcome to Payson, visit my business. Then everyone's comfortable with that. But in that same space, now if they change it to something else that may be offensive to someone or someone may not agree with, you're still meeting that time, place, and manner. And so then it becomes a free speech issue. So I know that, we want to support signs and we will allow businesses to have signs and be able to advertise. But once you allow that facility or that sign to be there, the content can change. And we may or may not be able to restrict the content that's in there.
Is there the ability to restrict the content? And
Well, that's where you get into,
That's a better question for the lawyer, because it comes back into that freedom of speech. But at the same time, if it's advertising derogatory, racially insensitive, or sexually explicit things, there's a potential that the city can at least have some authority to request that to be removed.
would that ever come across our desk?
No. The last one, anybody know what an IADU is? Internal Accessory Dwelling Unit. So this was put into state law 2 years ago, something like that. But basically what it is the city cannot restrict internal accessory dwelling units anywhere where there is a single family home. Meaning that as long as somebody is willing to put this accessory dwelling unit within their private home, you can't restrict it. But if it's on the same property in a separate unit, you could say no.
that's where they come from.
Correct, but it has to be attached. And there is various legislation and things that we can have as far as restrictions on how to regulate that and identify those, and that's goes through the whole process that we have for that. And we have to record that their property has an accessory dwelling unit on it. There's a application process and a vetting process. The owner must occupy the home. They cannot rent out the basement and the main floor, so to speak. They have to live there. And that's one of the things that state law allows us to restrict too. So if you see somebody that's got one of these going on and they don't live there, you can get some code enforcement if you want to. And then
Does it differentiate between mother-in-law living there versus like
no.
Does the dwelling have to have a kitchen?
Yes.
Closet?
Yes, it needs to have at least a kitchen facility and at least one bathroom facility in it and a separate entrance. They used to have a regulation that you had to share an entrance from the main building, but that's been removed. Is that correct?
I think you should have to keep the internal connection open. Because we've always allowed them to go in a separate entrance, but they just have to have the internal connection open. So it can still be a single family home. People want to convert back. So
Okay.
the duplex, because once you fully separate the units, one from the other becomes a duplex. And duplex requires there's different building codes that regulate separation between duplexes versus accessory structures.
So you can have a door between them.
I I believe Provo City on rentals and that type of thing, they mandated that you had to have a business license through the city. To do that.
So there are some cities that
Yeah,
do.
that was just a way of regulating them. Of course, a college town,
Knowing what's happening in all of the structures and who's there and making sure there's no parking. And but yeah, there's been several cities that have done more like good landlord programs and required licensing.
The extent of what we have is that application process, and then they record a document that basically states that they have this accessory dwelling unit on their property. And it runs with the property owner and not the land. So if they remove, it's not like the person coming in can come in and have one immediately. They have to apply for it.
And that's just another enforcement tool for us to then be able, doesn't mean that the new owner couldn't apply again to continue having that IADU. But then it's just another opportunity for us to go out to make sure that those requirements are still being met, because over time, things evolve into something that wasn't originally intended to be. So, yeah, so it's just one way of finding that, but making it so it's a little easier for, I mean, we know that there are basement apartments all over the city. And at first we didn't allow them. And then we went to requiring a process that was very cumbersome. And so it really discouraged people from coming in and complying. And so even before this mandate came from the state legislature, we already had some regulations in our code that would allow ADUs. We had to refine some things when this new legislation came out, but we had already taken the stance of we would rather people come in, talk to us about it, make sure it's converted in a safe manner, than people just doing it behind. We want the inspections. We want to make sure that that unit is safe for whoever's living there. So I felt like we had already taken a proactive approach that way, but then we had to, change some things to be consistent with state law. Whether or not it'll evolve even more, and there'll be more changes, we don't know. But it's another way than trying to find opportunities for housing.
Any more questions on this slide?
So what's your guess on the percentage of compliance that people have rentals in their house that actually run through the city? Single digits?
No, I don't know, but I do
Because
sense.
again, it comes down to the same thing. It has to be, somebody has to police the.
So we had a code enforcement issue with that I sent the police over there today on. And so when we get complaints and things like that, we try to get those addressed. And would it be shut down? Maybe not, but at least they should be doing it the right way. So,
The complaints are usually cars, I would assume, that cars.
or just, complaints of whatever's going on, can we investigate, that sort of thing.
And I don't know what the percentage would be, but I do know since we started allowing ADUs, we have a lot of people coming in with questions about that. And we've even had people that have been building new homes that they just wanted to design an ADU into new construction. I think most of them have been, conversions, but there's been a lot of conversation, and we like that. We like them to come in and even if sometimes you'll get individuals that'll come in and they'll start asking some questions and they don't really want you to know what they're doing. But you know that they want to ask, but they don't want to put the radar on their home. And so some will approach it as, hey, if you ever want it, because they'll say, well, we're just gonna have family living there. Because if it's family living there, that's different than if it's non-family. And so we try to approach it in a way of, but if you're going to alter it now, even for family, why don't you alter it in a way that it can be non-family? Because it leaves options for you in the future. And then I think they feel like, oh, okay, I'm not going to get in trouble with the city, but again, it's just about having the conversation. We want to know what's going on. We know that there's so many people that are doing that and it does not comply, and there could be code enforcement issues in the future. But if we could have a conversation with them now to help prevent that code enforcement, that's a priority.
We're really the only thing you're concerned about is the path communication, the entrance, and the connection.
Parking, making sure you're not.
They need to have at least one parking installed.
Well, and also we want it to still feel like a single family neighborhood. Even though there's an additional unit there, so there's some requirements on, you can't have a second driveway. I mean, you can use the existing driveway there, and you can add on to have that additional, but it's not like on one side of the house, you have a driveway here for this unit and the second driveway. Because really, if you're in the neighborhood, if you're living there, if you're driving through that neighborhood, it should still feel like a single family neighborhood. even though there's some additional, families that are living there. So it's about appearance also in the neighborhood and, not eliminating landscaping in the full yard in order to provide additional parking stalls. I mean, that could happen anywhere in the city, I guess, with, big or growing families. But, yeah, it's really about maintaining, a lot of people are investing in what they believe is a single family neighborhood, and we want to maintain that as much as possible. I mean, duplexes and twin homes, they work also, but just maybe in a different area, or with new construction.
Okay, let's continue. So we briefly touched on this a little bit, land use authority, appeal authority. The only thing I wanted to mention is with the appeal authority, like I said before, is they can't do both. They can't have been, for example, a member of the planning commission and then also a member of the board of adjustment and hear some sort of appeal that the planning commission made a decision on. Any questions on this slide before we continue? Okay. This one goes into a little bit more of the detail on the different actions and how it's kind of parceled out. You can see in the first column, the legislative column, it talks about that very broad authority and what can be done as far as the creation of new laws, the citizen input in those laws and those regulations, envisioning goals, things like that. You see the responsible bodies on that one. Planning Commission is an advisory body on the various things that we'll see at the bottom here. And City Council is the deciding body. They are that legislative body. So you can see we talked about these two, but the general Planning Commission is actually responsible for drafting and creating the general plan. Typically, when was it? It was a consultant that did it, what, in 2020? Typically, it's some sort of a staff or consultant kind of thing. They help out the Planning Commission, but it is brought to the Planning Commission. There's work sessions, there's public meetings, things like that to actually draft and develop that. Land use ordinances or zoning code, any other municipal ordinances, annexation policy plans, annexation zoning districts, all of those are legislative actions. And pretty much every one of those, except for I would say the municipal ordinances, are all things that the Planning Commission is an advisory body for. And then you can see you get into that second column, the administrative column. This is the enforcement section of the ordinances and codes and regulations. It also has a lot less latitude for interpretation. You can only interpret what's clearly defined there. You have to follow it to the letter. If they meet X, Y, and Z of the application process, it has to be allowed. It also needs to be noted, and I think that this Planning Commission does a very good job with this, that even though we hold public hearings on different items, that doesn't mean that the public necessarily has a huge influence on what an application is doing. Because if that applicant meets the requirements, again, they have to be allowed. We can still filter that comment, take it to council, let them know. Maybe they bring up some valid and significant points, and those would be some things to definitely consider in the deciding process. But it can't be public clamor, for example, in determining how to make a decision. So, and then the third column there is the quasi-judicial column, and that's the appeals process, district court, things like that. Any questions on this this slide? Okay. I think I'm going to kind of skip through this one because we've talked about this a little bit, and we've talked about the process on this. So if anybody has any questions, we can answer them. But otherwise, I think we're pretty good on this this slide. We're good. Jill loves an audience, and that's why she put these in there. But as you can see, most of the time our planning commissions are probably somewhere in between when we have our public hearings. Question for everyone. What's the difference between a public meeting and a public hearing?
Wouldn't it just be like a public meeting, the public can attend, but a public hearing, the public can include?
Correct? And they can be one and the same meeting. You would hold a public hearing within a public meeting. You're never going to hold a public hearing outside of a public meeting. But you don't have to take comment in a public meeting if you don't want to. Usually it's common courtesy and it's a good thing to do. You have to. Another thing that I want to mention with public hearings is you don't have to listen to everybody. You just have to listen to every point of interest. So if 2 or 3 people come up here and they keep saying the same thing, the chair, for example, can interrupt and say, we've heard that, we'll note it in the record. Does anyone have anything else they want to say that is not related to these items that have already been addressed? Part of that is to be respectful of everyone's time, but also to not be redundant in recording of minutes. And people can get up and just voice, I have the same comments as so-and-so, and be done. There's no reason to say the same thing over and over again. And then that also is helpful in limiting the length of public hearings. Any questions on hearings and meetings? Okay. This is pretty basic stuff here, talking about the ethical conduct of operating a meeting, the legal responsibilities. This is, we mentioned these already with what planning commission is required to do as far as their assigned duties to them, and then the political responsibilities of you represent the public good. You got to strike that balance between private property rights and the good of the community. Allowing citizens to have that active role. That's the kind of the meat and potatoes of the planning commission. This is the opportunity for the public to have some sort of forum to speak on various items. I find it kind of strange that's the case, but that's what the state of Utah does. Most people tend to think, oh, I go to city council, they're going to listen to me, they're going to hear me. Whereas here, oftentimes the case is, this is where the hearing is. There's no hearing at city council. Council doesn't have to hear you because it's not a hearing. So anyway, but that's the way state law is set up, is a planning commission hears the people. And so, any questions on this slide? Okay. Role of the individual planning commissioner. I think the gist of this one really is that you have no authority by yourself. You act as a body, and the majority rules. You obviously need to have a quorum to even have the majority to rule, but that's how your decision processes are made. You're not representing any specific neighborhoods, any specific businesses, any particular individuals. You represent the public good, and just to keep that in mind. But that being said, we may have conflicts of interest, right? So what do we do in a situation like that? You have to disclose it. This is an attorney question to answer, but you don't necessarily have to absolve yourself from voting on that item if you've disclosed it. But it would be a good practice if you have a personal interest in a particular item that you would do so. But again, that's an attorney question. You can ask Jason on what that line is. So need to respect the public process, the due process of rights amongst landowners. This is the line we're always walking with private property rights and the greater good of the community, right? We've got all these people that will come in here and they'll say, not in my backyard, don't do that, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, the applicant has their property rights too, and they should be able to do on their property what they want, but also strike that balance with the adjacent property owners of what's the effect and how's that going to balance between the two of them. So that's probably the most difficult thing to do in any land use decision process is that balance. Because everyone has their property rights and they need to be respected, and you get into a lot of trouble as far as legalities if they're not. But at the same time, there's property rights of others that may be affected.
Well, and that's why the general plan is so important, because I think that we are taking into consideration private property rights and not private property rights, but some are zoned or anticipated to be commercial or residential or industrial or whatever it may be. But that's where we're looking at what works for the community, because as mentioned or shown on a previous slide is, you know, communities have a lot of deference in creating our community, what we want our community to be. I mean, if we want our community to be the same as the next city down the highway, or if we want it to be different, or if there's similar to general plan, you're required to have certain things that you can expand from there. If there's, you know, if we happen to be a mountain community and there were certain things that we wanted to accomplish, or, you know, if we were along the ocean, or, you know, there's a lot of different makeup. And so that's why it, as a community, we have the ability to decide how our community grows, what we are, what uses we allow, other than the ones that were mentioned. I mean, there's certain protected uses that you have to allow in your community. But that's, you know, we will, as staff, we will always go back to say, what is the general plan say? What is the future for this property? Is the zoning that's being requested consistent with the general plan? Because that's, I think, where you balance property rights and the community interest.
So are the property rights basically just the zoning differences? Is that the main overseer of what your property rights are?
I think to answer your question, I think I understand what you're saying, but yes, I mean, each individual parcel of property has the variety of opportunities for it based on the zoning designation that it has.
So there's a variety of things within the zone around.
Right. And coming back to that whole idea of the policing power, policing meaning taking care of the general health, welfare, and safety of the public, and not police officer enforcement power, but general health, safety, and welfare. There's various things that limit people's private property rights in each particular zone and within that zone even. For example, setback requirements would be something that limits somebody's property rights, but it's been determined that that is something useful in helping to regulate, for example, the spreading of a fire, you know, amassing of too much clutter and density of things. So yeah, so there's the rights that are associated within the zone, and then there's the rights of the various zones. And so oftentimes, that being said, that's where we get the applicants wanting to get a zone change, and so that they can change what they can do there. The other rights that are stated in state law is this due process. And what that means is if somebody submits an application, they meet all of your requirements, they pay all of the fees, then they're entitled to this due process of law where you review and give them feedback and properly process their application. And then the last one that I would say is vested rights. And so once somebody gets, for example, preliminary plat approval, they have some vesting, meaning that there is some opportunity that they can do what they've requested because that's been vested with that preliminary plat approval.
Well, if I could just touch on that also, I mean, that's what's really, it's really important to talk about property rights and how they apply to each property, because, you know, this parcel here, they don't necessarily have the property. I mean, they may be residentially zoned and some over here is commercially zoned, and this may be valued more than this. It doesn't mean that we're keeping them from some development right because they're not commercial. I mean, they might not be in the correct location or next to infrastructure or next to, you know, transportation or whatever it is. But I think another one to touch on is like overlays. You know, their property right is what uses or what development potential they have on the property with the underlying zone that's on the property. And we have tools in our ordinance that allow somebody to come in and ask for a more intense use of the zone. So like an overlay zone, like RMO. If they wanted to do a duplex instead of a single family. So they might be in a single family zone. They have the ability through this overlay to maybe get a 2-unit structure, but it's a legislative decision that the planning commission and ultimately the city council in their legislative capacity does not have to approve. And so, so we've got to, what is that property right here, and then what are they asking for a more intense use of, and they're not necessarily entitled to that more intense use.
And that comes back again to this policing power that I stated before. Land use zoning has been around a little over 100 years now, and it's been defended in various court cases and upheld. And so the logic behind that is the state and, well, the federal government puts a lot of authority on the state, and the state defers that to local government to regulate the general health, safety, and welfare of their community. And by so doing, zoning has been upheld as one of those tools that does that. And so the local legislative body and planning commission are the ones that have been tasked with the responsibility to determine what is the ideal zoning for particular places within the community. And so it's not a taking of somebody's property rights just because something is zoned different than another parcel of property. Last bullet point on this thing, planning commission is subject to the same rule of ethics and procedures as elected officials. Any questions more on this one? Okay. Characteristics of a successful commission. I think this planning commission does very well at these various things. I'm not going to read each of those, but maybe we'll just leave it here for a moment and you guys can look at those. And if you have any questions, we can address those.
Do we consider city employees?
No. You're appointed officials.
So when there's a city, when an email comes out and says, hey, we're having a city pool party or a city employee pool party.
I'm sure they would allow you to come to a
Right.
city.
Yeah. For that particular instance, yes, you would consider.
I think there was a luncheon or something too. that
Yeah.
was mentioned.
Yeah.
Just a, oh, we're
Yes.
expected to.
You would be welcome at city luncheons, pool parties, whatever, retirement benefits, you gotta be on the payroll.
And when city employees are required to volunteer hours, we expect you to be there.
Yeah, did you read the cleanup emails?
I don't understand how required and volunteer go together. Anyway.
Required on.
Okay, we'll continue on. So these next few slides are the ones that I've added, and these are the specific duties that you as the Payson City Planning Commission have. And some of them we've already talked about. So for example, this number 1 is make recommendation to City Council on all, and it's all these various things. Subdivisions, preliminary plan, general plan amendments, zone changes, planned residential developments. What is it? Transit station development, is that what that stands for? Transit station overlay. Annexation petitions, may recommend on subdivision construction plans. I found that interesting, but so you can actually do that. And I think to some degree that's happened where we'll present some sort of conceptual layout plan or a preliminary plan, and planning commission oftentimes wants to see what the end product is going to look like, and you can give your feedback on that. So I already mentioned this with the transit overlay, but there's other overlay zones, and so that would be recommendation on that. Preliminary development plans in the multifamily zone, planned community plans, and code amendments. And then again, the second one is planning commission is required to hold public hearings on all of those on the bottom there. implicating several of the things that you would be making a recommendation on. Any questions on this slide before we continue?
So just anytime there's one of those 6 things at the bottom, there must be a public hearing.
Yes, each of these things require public hearings at the bottom there. Yeah.
So if we remanded some, had a public hearing, remanded and we push back, it doesn't necessarily have to happen.
Correct. It may or may be requested to have one, but once it's had a public hearing, that meets the state requirement of a public hearing anyway.
What is the state requirement on posting for public hearings at 7 days?
So it's 10 days and it's in 3 public places. So our website can do one. The Utah Public Notice website is another one, and then posted to here physically at City Hall is another one. We no longer have to post in the newspapers, and as of June, we actually took that out of the code, so it's not posted in the newspapers anymore.
I just still feel with the post office, there's some old postings for things in the thing over there.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
I think they lost their key. I think that's what we heard is that.
So after there's a public hearing in the planning commission, there is no need for a hearing in the city council.
So annexations typically have public hearings at City Council. General plan has them as well. So it's not required to have them at general plan, but Payson City has it in our code. And so the general plan would have them too.
Is that basically because people don't understand and they're not all complaining, so.
Well, going back to that comment I said before, most people tend to think that they attend city council, they want to be heard. So I think that's an opportunity for people to be heard when it's especially a controversial or a large development or whatever. That's an opportunity that if the city council wants to hold that public hearing, they can do that. Because oftentimes the public hearing at planning commission aren't as well attended. So, but meeting the letter of the law, those things as stated only need to be at planning commission. But you can be more restrictive, like Jill was mentioning, the general plan is required to have one at city council. And so we can do that too. You just can't be less restrictive. Okay, so here's some more specific duties. Did I skip one?
3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
How come that's not doing it? I don't know where that disappeared to. That's not important anymore.
It's on our printout.
It is on the printout. That's why I don't know how that disappeared because I printed this off a few minutes before.
Well, your other comment about the water use and preservation element is not.
That one, yes, that one I was reviewing state law and I saw, oh, there's another element here. So, yeah. So the other ones here, they're not shown on the slides for whatever reason. Number 3 is approved lot widths, frontages in the central commercial zone. And there's 3 minor bullet points under that. May replace city council as the legislative authority for any requirements within this zone. That's probably something that needs to be changed, just so you know. Because really legislative authority shouldn't be deferred from the city council. But that's what's in. May impose specific design guidelines, and this is all within that central commercial zone. May impose land use transition features, such as architectural or landscaping requirements. Number 4, the planning commission chair signs subdivision plats. Number 5, the planning commission gives input on, I believe this is what, commercial arts and parks zone requirements. Do we have a commercial arts and parks zone that's actually zoned anywhere? Okay, so it hasn't been applied. Okay, but it does exist. It's just not currently anywhere zoned for that. Review steep slopes for roads and vehicular routes. So that may be something, for example, that comes up with the Payson View Estates when they start submitting some of their phasing plans. And then number 7, provide written findings that states reasons for actions on any land use application. Number 8 gives final interpretation of zoning map boundaries. There's kind of a 4 or 5 bullet point list on determining the zoning boundaries, but the very last one, if you can't determine the zone boundaries, then that item would come to planning commission, and then you would make the determination of where that boundary actually lies. But typically they lie along streets, they lie along parcels or canals or natural features that you can identify. But when those things can't be identified, that's when it would come here to the planning commission. Prepares with staff the transportation master plan, may review subdivision concept plans. So you're welcome to join any of those types of meetings that we would have with potential developers on their We don't actually have a concept plan submittal process. And so we usually just do that informally with staff or in a DRC meeting, but you're welcome to join if you want to be a part
How
of
would
this.
we know?
There's times, I think this is more of, if there's sometimes that a developer will say, we want to take it to the planning commission and get their.
Like a work session.
Like a work session, so that's the forum that it would be in, that we'd actually come to this meeting to review a concept plan. Get feedback.
We have done that several times.
May require clustering of development in PDRs. And what is
It should
PDR?
be PRD.
That's what I was thinking, because that didn't roll off the tongue right. Land residential developments. And then the last one, and this is where the planning commission is the land use authority, is for subdivision plat amendments that do not involve the vacation, alteration of a street, or the right of way or easement. So basically any subdivision amendment that doesn't have one of those items, you would be the land use authority. Subdivision approvals of 3 or fewer lots. So we have the Lewis subdivision, for example. Planning commission is a land use authority for those.
So I'm assuming the word vacation is not used in the normal sense here.
Well, it's used in that normal sense in that it's, yes, that it would be going away.
Or like vacate. Vacation, like you're going on a trip. So vacating, yeah, but they call it vacation.
The alteration of the street or the right of way is going on vacation and not coming back. And then the last one is the planning commission is the land use authority for conditional uses.
No. That is a change that was made about a year ago. And we have a process of conditional use since we changed the ordinance. There's one that staff are reviewing right now.
See for you if and when it finally comes to fruition.
Yeah, so we do have one that you will have to make a decision on, but conditional uses again is one of those administrative processes and so we felt it was better that it be reviewed and approved by the planning commission and city council.
Can you give me an example of the conditional use?
I'll give you an example of the one we're reviewing right now. There is the expansion of the Geneva batch plant out here on Main Street, and they want to expand their plant. And so concrete mixing plants, for example, is a conditional use. And so that will eventually come here, I assume, unless they just decide to drop the project.
So conditional uses are really permitted uses that you may feel would just need additional conditions put on it for it to work well in a particular location, or you might have to put additional conditions on to mitigate maybe any impacts that may have on other uses in the area. So again, that's why it really should come back more of an administrative process, because it's really permitted, but you can put reasonable conditions on it to address those very specific concerns. So
To use the legal term, there has to be what they call a nexus between what you're requiring them to do as far as a condition and what it would be mitigating. So you can't require them to put pink flamingos in the front yard because you think they're pretty, but you could require them to put up a sound wall or something like that because they have heavy truck traffic or something like that. So That,
The only other thing, if I can just touch on that real quick.
I mean, look at it, it went out of place.
Yes, yes, so there it is. But, also, there has been some internal discussion among staff of maybe changing some of the authority of the planning commission. Actually allowing you to have the land use authority on more applications. So that may be coming to you guys in the future for a text amendment. To see if that's something you would support and the council would support. One that was brought up was even like with the free laws or less. You know, if somebody, you know, 3 was just an arbitrary number. 3 was just, let's test this out. We've been doing that for, you know, 6, 8 years now. I think it works really well. But it's like, oh, but as soon as you get to that 4th, it's like you have to go through the whole, so it's like, what is that good number? You know, is it 5? Is it 10? Is it, you know, is it any traditional subdivision regardless, you know, of the number of units? So we're working through that, as staff to come to you with a proposal for a code amendment. You know, some of those are pretty simple and straightforward. If they, again, they're administrative, if you meet X, Y, and Z, is it necessary to go through 2 courts? You know, after they've done staff review, it's something that the planning commission is very capable of taking care of, to make sure that all the requirements are met and the public hearing is held. Anyway, so you might see some changes on this. And we went over this one.
Yeah.
Right?
That, I think, is actually the end. So any questions? We went over the 20 minutes.
Very informal.
Okay. Turn the time back over to you.
Are there any conditions you don't want to talk about? Okay, then I move we adjourn.
One thing
Oh.
to mention, next meeting will be
The training.
at, are we meeting here? Or how's that?
So we're meeting at, and then before we log off, let's have Blair, we want to test the mics and the sound, so we need to see if Blair can at least comment, but it is at the Plunder Building, so at the business park. So we're not meeting here, we will meet right out there. I think everybody's RSVP or let us know that they're coming, and so we're talking about transportation and transit is what the subject matter will be. So we have an individual from Mountain Light Association of Governments that will be presenting, and we also have a gentleman from UTA. And then at the end, there is a panel of individual staff and elected officials from different communities to have a panel discussion at the end. So we're trying to make it, Robert's done a really good job of putting together, trying to make it 3 hours is a long time, you know, or 2.5 hours, whatever it is a long time. So he's trying to mix it up enough that it's interesting and valuable, and then recognizing that every community is a little different. Some communities have transit, some don't, some will in the future, some never will. But we want to have enough information that we feel like every commissioner can take something back to.
We wanted to test the flyers.
Oh, yes, Blair.
Can you hear us?
Try speaking into the, we just want to see if by chance the Zoom audio is working in this room.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can say.
Oh, Steve's gonna test something, so we're gonna have you try again in just a moment. Okay, try it again.
Can you hear me now?
Barely.
Barely. I think
I'll
we're
wait for
actually, yeah, we've just had some challenges the last couple of meetings in this room, and so Steve was here to work, you know, to adjust the sound system while you're here. Steve, you want to try again? Okay, try again, Blair.
Can you hear me now?
Barely.
Yeah, barely. I think we might just be hearing it through a laptop maybe, but. Okay, we'll keep working on it, but thanks for joining us, Blair. We appreciate it.
All right. Okay, for real now, I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All right, everyone has All in favor?
Yes.